Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, okay, what did Sweden do in World War II? Scandinavia's neutral power, 1939 to 1945. History with Hilbert, good channel, preemptive like. Okay, first of all, my name's Connor. If you're new, where are my manners? I like to learn about things and watch stuff. Original link to the video, top of the description. Right below that, link to the Discord. Click on it, send you right over there. Love to have you. If you don't get assigned a role right away, don't worry, I will promote you. Okay, so Sweden. They had a lot of resource, like the coal, right, or iron ore that Germany needed. They weren't exactly in a great geographical position to really choose their side. I'm sure they kind of saw Germany, and I don't know. Let's learn.
In this series, I've looked at the roles of countries not normally associated with the Second World War and asked what did they do during that most famous of recent conflicts.
Right.
Well, in today's video, I'd like to shine that spotlight on Sweden and what Sweden did during the Second World War. Now, if you look back at Sweden's history from the Vikings
Make
and through to the
Gustavus
Great Northern War and its struggles with Russia, it's quite a warlike history. So it might surprise you that after around 1809 with the Napoleonic Wars and 1812
Bernadotte.
with the last invasion, Sweden had actually remained at peace and would do so until the start of the Second World War in Europe
Interesting.
in 1939. During this time, Sweden became a lot smaller geographically, as it essentially shedded Finland, which became a new country to its east. During the First World War, Sweden decided to remain neutral, and in the post-war years, there was a very strong socialist movement in Sweden that was generally split between a smaller, more radical communist wing and
Question. So Finland had some issues with Russia. Everyone knows that. Finns fought the Russians. Went. Oh, sorry. So were they helping the Finns out much at all? I gotta listen.
and a more liberal social democratic wing, both of whom wanted to bring about reforms. At the same time, there was a backlash from more conservative and right-wing parties, a similar situation to what was seen throughout most of Europe in the post-First World War years. This communist faction was emboldened by the fact that in 1917 the Bolshevik Revolution broke out in neighboring Russia, and in the following years the Russian Empire would fall following the Russian Civil War and would be completely replaced by the world's first communist government, the USSR or Soviet Union, which was aided by many of the Swedish communists who wanted to spread that communist revolution into Sweden as well. It was during these years in the early 1930s that Sweden decided its best position with its ruling Social Democrat government was to stand between the rising powers of the Soviet Union, who threatened Sweden directly, and the rising march of the Nazis in Germany. During these years, Sweden maintained a neutrality between the rising powers in the East and the West, thinking that this would spill out into a war in the Baltic if the situation wasn't managed.
Wasn't Finland already sort of playing that role, though? So it kind of...
Sweden also started to prepare for the worst, investing more in its military, and in 1936 investing in 2 new tank battalions, and 2 years later in 1938 men above the age of 15 were conscripted for short periods of time, and some of them were kept training in order to prepare the country's defences. The balance of power that Sweden hoped would keep the Soviets and the Germans occupied with each other and therefore not
Sorry, just like they would go on the... Like they're just getting kids who are 15 ready to fight for when they're 17, 18, or...
interested in keep the Soviets and the Germans occupied with each other and therefore not interested in expanding into Sweden fell apart in 1939 with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which brought the Soviets and the Germans together after they planned to partition Poland. This, of course, would spark the powder keg that would set off Europe into the Second World War. And Sweden, for its part, retained its stance of neutrality even as the Western Allies prepared for another war with Germany. In doing so, when the Polish submarines attempted to escape Poland and went into Polish waters, they were indeed captured, and its crews were interned in Sweden for the duration of the war, as Sweden was a neutral country, and in essence this was a violation of their territorial waters. Sweden, however, did not take it as likely when the Soviet...
So, Polish submarines were trying to escape through Swedish waters, and Sweden didn't want to make it seem like it was if Sweden let them through. This is a question. If Sweden let them through, then it would seem to outside powers that they are siding, and so they have to be like, "Hey, we're neutral." Voice crack. We have to take you because of that.
Union started its winter war with Finland in November of 1939. And during this time, the Swedish public, and certainly many of its politicians, were in favour of helping the Finnish against the Soviet Union. Even if this never led to a direct declaration of war, they did change their stance from neutral to non-belligerent.
Okay.
And many Swedes, up to around 8,760, volunteered to fight alongside the Finnish against the Soviets.
Okay.
Around 70,000 Finnish children were also evacuated to Sweden during this period, and there was a lot of tacit support from Sweden's government in other means towards Finland in their war against the Soviets. In 1940, the war would come even closer to Sweden as the Germans invaded Denmark and then leapfrogged over and invaded Norway during this time as well. Denmark, of course, would famously last only a few hours, while the campaign in Norway would span several months with Allied involvement. The Swedes, who had their forces amassed on the border with Finland in case there would be decisive action from the Soviet Union if they had broken through Finnish defences, were due to be sent home. But with the invasions of Denmark and Norway, Sweden feared that it would be next and would need to mobilise its forces. However, the Germans had insisted that Sweden not mobilise its forces, or this might be taken as a reason to invade Sweden as well. And so they were able to, instead of bringing this force of 100,000 men into mobilization, the Swedes sent individual letters to the Swedish homes to bring the forces up and to give them the information of where they should assemble for...
Fast forward if you want to when I don't understand what just happened. If you don't want me to go through it again, fast forward. I need to understand.
And would need to mobilize the invasion through Finnish defences were due to be sent home, amassed on months with Allied involvement. The Swedes, who had their forces amassed on the border with Finland in case there would be decisive action from the Soviet Union if they had broken through Finnish defences, were due to be sent home. But with the invasions of Denmark and Norway, Sweden feared that it would be next and would need to mobilise its forces. However, the Germans had insisted that Sweden not mobilise its forces, or this might be taken as a reason to invade Sweden as well. And so they were able to, instead of bringing this force of 100,000 men into mobilization, the Swedes sent individual letters to the Swedish homes to bring the forces up and to give them the information of where they should assemble for their mobilization rather than an official mobilization.
Okay, I'm not going to go back again, but can one of you guys... so they had their troops on the kind of Finnish front, on the Finnish border, because they were afraid if the Finns fell, then the Russians, then Sweden would be next for the Soviets. And so they moved them and saw hostilities in Norway, and so wanted to put them over there. But then the Germans said that would be cause for invasion. I'm not quite sure what...
thus bypassing the Nazis' demand that they not actually mobilize their forces. And in this way, in a short time, they were able to raise an army of around 320,000 men to mobilize and started to prepare defenses along the border with Norway. In 1940, the Swedish also started to prepare their own Home Guard, a paramilitary force that would work together with the official military if indeed Sweden were invaded. During the Germans' campaign in Norway, they demanded of the Swedish government access to telephone and telegraph lines going through Sweden, which would allow High Command in Germany to communicate more efficiently with its forces deployed in Norway. The Swedes agreed to this, but at the same time they tapped these lines, and in doing so Arne Berling was able to access the German Geheimschreiber, similar to the more well-known Enigma machine.
I kind of got close there.
Was used to code messages between the German army. and in doing so, thanks to Berling's efforts, the Swedish government was able to listen in on the military intentions of the German. And in fact, to do this, the company Ericsson, which we now know from the more famous Sony Ericsson after its merger, actually built machines to be able to decode the encryptions that the German army was sending using these devices. After figuring this out, the Swedish government passed this information on to the Polish resistance, who were then able to communicate it with the Western allies, thus giving them an advantage during the war thanks to this Swedish codebreak. For example, the allies were able to find out where the Bismarck was located in northern Norway on several occasions because of Swedish intelligence. If you're looking to in northern Norway on several occasions because of Swedish intelligence. If you're looking to invade Norway and want to hide some private, personal, or military or otherwise information, then today you'll be glad to know that NordVPN
I knew it.
can help. This is
a
virtual private
if you'd like to sponsor
network that secures
we're going to go through it, but
when you're away
make sure if you do NordVPN from this video, click on the sponsor down here, /Hilbert. It helps out their channel. Want to make sure if I can react to this stuff.
With NordVPN, there are several great advantages, such as that there are over 5,000 servers in 60 different countries. It's available on Windows, on Android, iOS, macOS, and Linux. It's also the fastest of all the virtual private networks out there, and you can access all your favorite TV, movies, and games from abroad. There's even a special offer for viewers of this channel. If they go to nordvpn.com/Hilbert and use the special passcode Hilbert, then they can get a 2-year plan with an additional month at a huge discount. So definitely check it out because it will be linked in the description below.
And it lets the advertiser know they came from Hilbert,
with NordVPN,
and therefore
be
give
mobile,
him more money.
Be safe, and be connected. With the battles in Norway raging on, Sweden found itself blockaded by both the Germans on the North Sea side and the Allies, as well as in the Baltic. This was a great problem for Swedish trade, and its economy plummeted as a result of being blockaded on many sides. There were still some in Sweden who did try to trade on, but many Swedish seamen became the target of both German and Allied vessels during this time. Sweden was also in an uncomfortable position, lodged between the Axis-aligned Finland and the battles raging in Norway, where the Germans were gaining the upper hand. Indeed, during the Battle of Narvik, the German government requested to transport its troops through Sweden from northern Finland in order to take part in the battle. Sweden had actually allowed this under the pretense that these were medical personnel, but in reality there were 10 times as many combat soldiers and heavy equipment on board these trains as the medical personnel, and the Swedish government was found afterwards to have been aware of this fact and yet to have given in to the German demand anyway and allowed the troops to be transported. In 1941, a similar thing happened when the Germans were preparing for Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. The Swedish once again allowed German soldiers to be transported using Swedish trains and through Sweden.
This is the thing about being a country in war where you're not, so like if you're not Russia, you can say Japan, but Japan is so far away from the European theater. So Russia, Germany, France, UK. Those four. Those are like the four powers, it seems like, have any sort of real say in what they're going to do that is outside of their geography. I hope this is going to make sense. But kind of second and third tier militaries at the time, military countries, it really depends on their geography, on what they're able to do. Like a country like Sweden, where, take Denmark, for instance. Like Denmark is whatever if the Germans intend to take you over, you're going to be taken over. And so you have to do what you can to make sure your country survives and is hurt the least amount. And there's a country like Poland where you're at the whim of giant countries on either side of you. And then you're like Sweden, which isn't strategically as important to the Germans as a Poland is in terms of their final goal to get into the Soviet Union. Let me know if I'm wrong or you disagree, obviously. But a country like Sweden, where they're not powerful enough at the beginning of the war to really have a say in what not have a say, to have a complete say in what they're going to do, and they have to realize, okay, Denmark's over here, Finland is over here, Germany's down here, Russia's over there, and so it's hard to really judge them based on simply what they allowed certain sides to do, and you have to take into account what their options were. I hope that made sense.
Something which caused a great scandal and a deep division in Sweden and indeed after the war, when this was seen to have been collaborating with the German regime. It's also true that around 37% of Sweden's exports were for Germany, because the Baltic, basically the largest coastline that Sweden has access to, was basically controlled by the Germans, who had occupied Poland and who would later push into the Baltic states as well. It's also true that Sweden was the largest supplier of iron ore to Germany from a neutral country during the Second World War, something which caused great controversy and which Winston Churchill famously spoke about, saying it must be understood that an adequate supply of Swedish iron ore is vital to Germany. The effectual stoppage of the Norwegian ore supplies to Germany ranks as a major offensive operation of the war. No other measure is open to us for many months to come which gives so good a chance of abridging the waste and destruction of the conflict, or of perhaps preventing the vast slaughters which will attend the grapple of the main armies.
It's insane to me how the natural resource problem that Germany had. It's crazy, and it makes me imagine, what if Germany had the resources and the infrastructure to bring those resources to them that the Soviet Union or the British had, or the Americans, I guess you could say too, but they're so far away, and so the British have all their colonies and their navy to bring in supplies, and the Soviet Union has all their natural resources and their massive land and the amazingly protected Caucasus oil fields. I mean, it seems like you couldn't have a more perfect spot to put your precious oil fields than where it is in Russia at the time of World War II. You have the Caspian and the Black Sea. You have the Caucasus Mountains to the south. You have the vast, Russia in the north, where you have to get it through, and so much land. And so imagine if Germany had all of that stuff. Like, imagine they didn't have to, they had all of the iron and all of the oil they needed. Imagine just what they could have done. And I'd imagine nothing would have stopped them.
And indeed, before the Allies had been ousted from northern Norway, there was actually a plan to...
I mean, maybe Britain and the US would eventually, and the Soviet Union...
Before the Allies had been ousted from northern Norway, there was actually a plan to swing across the north of Norway and invade Sweden in order to capture this vital resource. But this never ended up happening. Around 180 Swedes ended up joining the Waffen-SS, the elite Nazi troops of the German army. However, this is quite a small number compared to others in different countries that were, of course, occupied by the Germans, and indeed from several other neutral countries, as the Swedish government had made it illegal to join the SS. Around 8,000 Swedes, however, also joined the Norwegian resistance, and several Swedish merchants also became blockade runners to supply things like ball bearings and other goods to the Allies. Of course, if these ships were caught by the Germans, they would a lot of the time be blown up for trading with the enemy. As a neutral country, Sweden played an important role as a safe haven for those seeking to escape the Nazis, particularly in neighbouring Norway, with whom it shared a long border, a lot of it through very treacherous terrain of mountains and forests. However, around 50,000 Norwegians did flee into Sweden during the war. And following 1943, when it looked like the Germans were on the back foot on the Eastern Front, the Swedes decided to relax some of their policies, as they no longer feared that the Germans would mount an invasion of their country if they didn't comply with the Germans in everything. And in doing so, from these 50,000 Norwegian refugees, most of whom would be held in Småland or Södermanland, they decided to create the Norwegian police forces of around 15,000 men. The reason being that they were police forces is because they didn't want to antagonize the Germans too much, but essentially these forces received weapons training, and this was in all intents and purposes an army ready to take back Norway from the Germans that was being trained by the Swedes.
Interesting.
And in 1944, these Norwegian troops that had been trained in Sweden, together with Norwegian troops that had made it to the United Kingdom and fought under the British Army, were able to liberate an area in northern Norway.
I want to say it takes a lot of balls of courage, to be over in America and say, being opposed to Germany, and it's a lot easier to say all this stuff about the German army and everything when you're an ocean away, but when you're Sweden or you're Poland, especially Poland, my God, or France, to kind of secretly be arming yourself up against a larger power that is going to harshly punish you if you're found out is very admirable.
There was also a force of Danes who were able to get into Sweden. Of course, this was more difficult as they would have to cross the sea arm to get into Sweden, and these numbered around 3,600. And in 1945, with the liberation of Denmark, they were also called in to help. Now, before the war, lots of Jewish refugees had made their way to Sweden to avoid persecution by the Germans. However, Sweden had turned most of them away. But in 1942, they decided to change their policy and allowed Jewish refugees into the country to seek asylum from the horrors being committed against them. And around 900 Jews from Norway were able to find safe haven in Sweden. And while this isn't a huge number, this was around half of the entire Jewish population of Norway at the time.
Wow.
And in 1943, one of the stunning feats of survival during the war is that around 8,000 Danish Jews, which was the vast majority of the Jewish population in Denmark, were ferried by Danes across the strait with Sweden and brought to safety there. And during the war, the Swedish also provided around 9,000 Christian or atheist Danes with safe harbor to stop being persecuted during the occupation. It's also true that the King of Sweden at the time was also trying to use his position in aiding the Germans.
Wow, he's like 6'5", 100 pounds. Seems like an older guy, though. So
at the time was also trying to use his position in aiding the Germans in some things to plead for a more humanitarian approach to the Jews, that they wouldn't be treated as terribly as they were by the Germans, although of course this was to no avail in the end.
I always wondered, watching World War II things, how much obviously it was clear the animosity towards Jewish people that many people in Europe, but especially Germany, had. But to the scale of the stuff they were doing in terms of the Holocaust, and I know a lot of the death camps happened towards the end of the war, how much was known. Sorry if I've asked this in a few other videos. Sorry if you answered this already. But I just wondered the scale of persecution against Jewish people and other ethnic minorities the Germans didn't like, the extent of what was going on. I wonder what was known. Makes sense, kind of.
In 1945, the Swedes were also part of a plan called Operation Rede Danmark, which was the plan of Operation Save Denmark, to bring in Swedish soldiers to potentially aid in an allied takeover of Denmark from the Germans. They would also allow the Americans and other allied forces to use Sweden as the base of their operations for bombing runs against German-occupied Denmark, although in the end this wasn't needed. At the end of the war, Sweden had been more on the side of the Allies, aiding them in potential invasion of Denmark, which of course never got off the ground, although they had remained neutral for much of the war. However, they had also been very pragmatic in their neutrality, helping the Germans in some ways and allowing them to transport troops through the country, but of course, more importantly, also supplying them with the iron ore that they so desperately needed. And especially the British were not pleased with the Swedish in the slightest for doing this, as they had fought tooth and nail against the Germans the entire war. The Soviets too demanded that the Swedes give over many of the Baltic SS troops that had fled into Sweden following the collapse of the Nazi German Reich. The problem was that many of these had come from countries like Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania, which had themselves been occupied by the Soviets at the start of the war. And they knew that many of them, by handing them over to the Soviets, would be put to death in labor camps. And yet they were forced to hand them over, which caused somewhat of a political crisis in Sweden at the time. But that is it for this video on Sweden in the Second World War. I hope you've enjoyed this video, because many people have actually recommended that I look at Sweden.
It was a very good video. History with Hilbert, great channel. So I learned a lot, but it's also what I would have expected, but also a little more resistance, I guess, than I would have expected. So given the situation they were in and their location, they had to deal with the situation they were given, and I think that they dealt with it pretty well, honestly. Still learning. I should get back into the World War I series videos on different countries there. I got like 15 videos in, and also looking at other Kraut videos as well. And History with Hilbert, if there are other countries you guys like me to check out. Spain right there. I'll do that. Awesome. See you guys next time.